tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
One thing that was quite interesting here, I spent a bit of time on Monday kind of doing the contrast between the ARC Forum and its logical counterpart in some ways, the World Economic Forum. These are both global summits with leaders from various fields that are coming together to talk about ideas. And the key contrast between the two, I think, is that the ideas here at the ARC Forum are rooted in the value of the individual, the celebration of humanity and Western civilization. The ideas you hear about at the World Economic Forum are nihilistic and cynical and very anti-human and certainly anti-individual. And I think there's, generally speaking, a broader understanding of that here. It was a very optimistic place. Now, politics has not been an optimistic place in the last few years, and I would say for good reason. We've had some of the most incredible incursions on our civil liberties, not just our own bodily autonomy, but our freedom of speech, our freedom of movement. And politics has become a lot more reactive as a result. So I worried that everyone coming together would kind of be more grievance-oriented in their way. And I was quite pleased, and I will say pleasantly surprised to see that was not the case. There was a message of hope. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't some skeptics among us. I had a few little snide conversations on the sidelines. Not snide, I should say, but a few more, I'll say, cynical conversations on the sidelines with people. But of all the backgrounds we saw, people from the US, the UK, Canada, Spain, Germany, Austria, Australia, people from media, people from politics, all of this, people had their own approaches, their own backgrounds, their own challenges. There was one common thread that I saw in almost everyone there, which was a rejection of wokeness and a rejection of wokeism. That, to me, is so key here. And I think there's actually a fair bit of hope in all of that, you can bring together so many people from around the world, and everyone says, all right, we may disagree on this policy or that policy. You may be from the British House of Lords, and I may be from Duck Dynasty, but surely we can all agree we don't want wokeness. Now, what is wokeness? Well, you ask some different people, you're going to get different answers. One of the things that I will point out, though, is that there was a rejection of this idea that children should be taught just untenable things about the world, which are simply not true. Like, oh, I don't know, there are 47 genders instead of 2 biological sexes, that parents are not the ones that should be responsible for their children's education, that we should allow grievance and microaggressions to govern speech and discourse rather than just allowing humans to govern themselves and be civil, and if they're offended, to just not want the state's intervention. I mean, these are all very anti-woke values, which shouldn't be left versus right, but have increasingly been so. And I had a number of conversations where I wasn't even intending to set out down this road. And one of them I did, and that was with James Lindsay, who you may know from X, or Twitter, as we used to call it back in the day, by which I mean like 2 weeks ago. James Lindsay, who goes by Conceptual James on Twitter, and actually was speaking to a very large crowd in Alberta a few weeks ago, and I was trying to get him on the show then, and we just weren't able to work it out time-wise. But I sat down with James Lindsay, and I wanted to talk about wokeness in that proper context here, where it comes from, and more importantly, what on earth we do about it. Not sure if you can distill this big question down into a simple soundbite answer, but I'll give you an opportunity to do so. Where does wokeness come from?
Hell, no, it's the evolution of Marxist thought into the Western context. The Western context is not suited to an economic Marxism because the Western world, with its access to liberty and markets, has enabled upward mobility economically. So it's very hard to say that the worker is intrinsically oppressed and motivate a workers' party when the worker can look at his buddy who said, well, they'll just work harder and you can move up and you can start your own company if you want and everything. And so they had to modify it in thought. You see this in the 60s. They say that we have to move from the working class as our base for revolution and into identity politics. We have to look for a new basis for this energy because the West wasn't suitable to it. So that's where it comes from.
The oppressor-oppressed dynamic makes for some very weird and inconsistent positions. I mean, you were just in Canada recently. You know that Muslim families were leading the charge on the parental rights battles, kind of getting gender ideology out of schools. You fast forward a couple of weeks, and all of a sudden now Muslims are the oppressor or the oppressed group instead of the oppressor. If you talk to some of the people on the left, and the people on the left don't seem interested in trying to reconcile these inconsistencies.
Yeah, that's because this oppressor-oppressed thing is a useful kind of naming heuristic. But what really it is the people and groups and situations that are advancing leftism are good, and the situations and circumstances and groups that are hindering leftism are bad. This is explicit, and I think this is a Maoist project. Woke is a Maoist project. Come to the West. Mao actually says, and he gave a lecture in 1957, or a public speech, on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. And he says immediately, well, who are the people and who are the enemies of the people? Let's distinguish. And he says very clearly, the people who are advancing the cause of building socialism are the people. The people who are hindering the cause of building socialism are the enemies of the people. So it's very clear. That which they can use to advance leftist agendas, oppressed. That which they can't use or that's stopping them from advancing, oppressor, bad, destroy.
People on the right oftentimes want to deal with this by going after the institutions that tend to give the wokest their support. Is that the right approach? Where do you think the way in is to start pushing back against this?
I mean, they've infiltrated so thoroughly that it's very difficult. We do need to start working our way back toward reclaiming which institutions we can. That's going to happen through personnel. In other words, firing woke people when they abuse their positions in power, which they are wont to do eventually, and replacing them with people who are not woke, and having policies arranged to push in that direction or push back in that direction, and simultaneously through changing what I refer to kind of broadly as the liability field. What I just talked about, it's a liability to get hired, it's a liability to keep your job, to be woke, blah, blah, blah. That's part of the liability field, but usually I'm talking about lawsuits where there are discrete harms that are so egregious in a place like Canada. It's got to be so egregious that the courts can't ignore it. The U.S. is a little more friendly to that. I also think, by the way, that the U.S. and Canada, just to remark, should keep bouncing the energy against woke ping pong ball across the 48th parallel, because we're doing a great job motivating each other. I think we're actually a wonderful pair for once.
There is an anti-woke left. I'd say it's probably not as large as it should be, and a lot of the people in it tend to get typecast as being, evil right-wing racists, Nazis, and whatever. But is there a concern that that coalition among the anti-woke will be too thin to survive if you drill down and, people who are in the trenches saying, yeah, we don't like wokeness, don't really agree on anything else?
The thing is that the anti-woke left is beholden to the power center of the left by virtue of the fact that they still commit to the left. And the power center of the left currently is woke. So they are caught between a rock and a hard place, and sort of almost a black hole. It either sucks them in or flings them completely out into, like you said, right-wing nut job land, even though they're kind of determined leftists. And it's a very big challenge that this group has to deal with, that they would also benefit from woke losing its influence over the left in a, whether sane is the right word or not, but a non-woke left emerging back into the ecosystem of left-wing thought that's permissible would be, beneficial for them. I think that under present circumstances, unless woke has actually dealt itself a fatal self-inflicted wound with this supporting Palestine-Hamas thing, I think that that's going to be a very challenging thing for the left to do. The woke are going to have to be discredited on other terms.
Do you think gender is the issue that's going to destroy that leftist coalition? Because it seems to be the one that has the most broad support for the anti-woke position. The idea that there are two sexes. If you talk to ordinary people on the street, that's a relatively universal thing, but you wouldn't see that reflected in the institutions.
Well, until 3 weeks ago, I would have said most definitely, because I hadn't quite considered how powerfully the anti-Semitism would manifest itself. And that seems to be waking people up much faster, and in particular waking up people with money who are very concerned about what they're funding. I think there's a little bit of irony. We've had such a robust education in the West about Nazis and how bad Nazis are and everything, which is good for that, so that we're very sensitive to recognizing those trends, and we're very sensitive to wanting to shy away from them immediately. But on the other hand, we've learned virtually nothing about communism. So now we find ourselves in the position where the left is championing something that's calling, I mean, at times explicitly, for gassing Jews, and all of a sudden this is a shock moment that's breaking people open. As for gender, though, it's the most obviously most untrue position. It's the one that touches the most lives. Being a parent is not a political position. Unlike what the feminists want to say, that the personal is political, parenting is not a political act. And most parents don't think of it as a political act. They think of it as a get through the day and make these kids have enough to eat and the best, environment that they can on a day-by-day basis, with just the challenges of parenting. And so what it threatens to allow, and what it is allowing, like we saw in Canada with Muslims and Sikhs and Christians and agnostics and Jews all coming together up until this recent conflict, what we saw was that parenting transcends all the other boundaries, political, religious, and it gives the ability to build a gigantic coalition, plus to start shaking people loose from the cult and thinking something's badly wrong here. We're doing, to be as generous as possible, highly aggressive surgical interventions on mentally unwell children as the pathway to treatment, as the primary pathway to treatment, and threatening to take parental rights away from them through the state if they don't go along with this. This is a scary moment for parents, and scary moments wake people up.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.